Good afternoon, Raj.
Good afternoon, Wakas.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for being on the podcast. I know that your time is valuable these days, and your time at home is precious because of all the other intense stuff that you're doing. So I appreciate you coming here and talking to us today.
It's an absolute pleasure.
I was thinking about how to introduce folks to who you are, and I didn't know where to start. I wanted to talk to you about the service that you've been doing over the past couple of years, especially. I wanted to talk to you about your various interests in life and growing up in the Midwest. We are talking today in St. Louis. Your journey, so to speak, didn't start in St. Louis, did it?
No, it did not. So I was born in Chennai, which used to be called Madras.
Okay.
In South India.
Uh-huh.
So that's where both my mother and father are from.
I see.
So I was born there, and then they are both physicians, so when it came time for them to move on to the next phase of their life, they decided to move to the U.S. So that was, I think, around 1973, so I would have been around 3.5 or 4 years old, roughly.
I have other friends. John comes to mind, who was born in Hungary, and then his parents moved here to Chicago when he was 3 or 4 years old. So, do you have any memories of being a little guy in India at all?
Hey, it's interesting. All of my memories of India from that age, I do have some, but they're all in black and white for some reason.
How curious!
Yeah, it's interesting, and they're just flickers of memories here and there. I remember being with my grandmother in the car with her, and I think we were on our way to school, and we stopped somewhere, and a teacher came by to say hi, but I kind of hid in the car, and that's the only memory I have of that. But a few things here and there.
At what age do you think we start acquiring, lasting memories? I insist when I'm talking to my family that I remember one of my earliest birthdays, which would have been, 2 years old maybe, and I remember very vividly this mechanical wind-up toy horse that I was given as a birthday gift. And the reason I remember it, it was brown in color, and it would rear up on its rear legs, as part of its... and I remember it vividly, and my family insists that I was too young at that time to have that recollection. And I wonder if, during the course of telling and retelling of our childhoods, if we acquire other people's memories and make them our own.
That's interesting. Yeah. I think it's maybe a little bit of both, but I think, by the book, around the age of 2 is when I've read that the lasting memories, and usually it's some kind of event that maybe made a person feel a certain way at a certain time, and that's what sticks with you. But oddly enough, after I moved to the U.S., I have a lot of memories, and they're all in color for whatever reason.
So that's interesting. Do you remember coming to the States and that change?
I don't remember the journey itself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember that, but I do remember my family. We moved to Baltimore, Maryland, in the beginning, and I do have a lot of memories of that apartment complex that we lived in, and I remember going to preschool there, and so I do have recollections of that.
Baltimore, huh?
That's where we started.
Yeah. So from Chennai to Baltimore, that sounds like the title of a novel that would make for interesting reading. Huh?
That's right.
So that's where your parents did their residencies, I'm assuming.
So the first 3 years of probably 3 years of our stay in the U.S. My dad did his internship and his part of his residency in internal medicine. So we were in Baltimore for 2 years, and then Clarksburg, West Virginia, for 1 year, and then we moved to Chicago. This would have been about 1975 or something like that. And then that's where my folks, who are both physicians, they did their residencies in Chicago.
How long were you in Chicago for?
We were there for 4 years.
So did you go to school in Chicago? Do you
I
remember where
did.
you guys lived in Chicago?
Yeah, we lived. Oh, yeah. So we lived on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive.
Oh,
which
I remember that well. I lived on
so
Martin Luther King
you
Jr. Drive
probably-
as well.
Probably lived in the same.
Prairie Shores Apartments.
Prairie Shores. Yes. Wow.
What a
we
small
knew that
world.
we knew that this was aligned in some way. Yeah. In fact, we were in. So as you know, it's 5 apartment complexes that are identical, and they're unmissable as you're driving into the city from that angle. And we lived in the second building.
Yeah,
Apartment 217.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. My
Yeah.
son was born when we were living in that apartment
wow.
on Prairie Shores. You
Okay.
know, Michael Reese Hospital, which used to be the
Yes.
hospital close to that, has since been torn down, and there's some other edifice has gone up in place of it.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Have you ever gone back there and revisited?
So I've been back to Chicago many times, and I, very fondly will look over at those apartments, as I'm driving by, but have never actually been back to the apartments
Right.
themselves. But yeah, a lot of memories there, for sure.
So you were in grade school at that time?
Yeah, I was in Chicago. It was from grades 2 through 5.
Okay.
I was there.
And then your family moved to Peoria.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, Peoria, Illinois.
So, most of the typical school experience for you happened down in Peoria.
So in Peoria, yeah, I went to basically what would be considered junior high and high school in Peoria.
How was that?
It was interesting. So we're talking. This was so we moved to Peoria in 1979. So I was there until 1986, and it was a unique experience, to put it that way. Namely because there weren't that many Indian families there at the time, and as a result, the ones that were there, we were all very close to each other.
Right, community.
A lot of my childhood friends from that age are, ones that I still have today from that small little Indian community. My parents were just starting to kind of find their way into their respective jobs, and high school, quite honestly, it was a little rough at first, because I was the only Indian kid in my class.
Uh-huh.
And I think back then, people, they weren't sure. Is he Mexican? Is he Greek?
Right,
Is
right.
he, who is this guy?
Yeah.
So, and I, as a result, I just, kind of kept to myself a lot, and it was only really later that, I kind of grew into being a little more involved in the social aspect of being a teenager. But it was a little, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a little bit rough at times.
So, perhaps I can provide a little bit of, my perspective, because those of us who come to the States as adults more often than not, especially in our field of work, nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, etc. When we come here, we're usually, we've done, a a lot of our education and some of our training, and then we train. And as we're all well too familiar, healthcare training doesn't really lend itself to a lot of social life after the training is done. It's consuming, it is demanding. There's a lot to be done even when you're done with work, because you got to catch up on work, etc. And trying to maintain a family and spending time with your kids, that automatically, I shouldn't say it's an obstacle, but I think it becomes a little challenging to maintain a social circle and try and get integrated into the dominant culture, which is prevalent at that time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, I think, my parents were going through, unbeknownst to them, I think, when you're actually going through it, you don't sit and think about, oh, I'm going through a big cultural change. It just kind of happens around you. And, for sure, myself and the other Indian kids who are my age, we were sort of caught between two cultures, and wanting to be a part of both, and without a doubt, we rebelled against our Indian heritage and
Yes.
culture to a degree, but at the same time didn't really fit into American culture in the true sense, even though, other than being in the house at home with our parents, that's what we were surrounded by. So it was an interesting, and actually, at this, now looking back on it, very thankful that I was exposed to everything. But while going through it, it was a little bit challenging, to say,
A little
say
rough.
the least. Yeah.
And take heart. I went through my teenage years in the country that I was born in, and it was still rough.
Yeah.
And there was still a period of rebellion, and I think that period of rebellion lasted well into my 20s. And so it's interesting, rebellions take all kinds of form. I think my rebellion started with the writing of poetry and me riding motorcycles, and then it progressed or regressed into drinking and using substances that were frowned upon by society in general. In yours, I think it took the more acceptable, or who knows, you can tell me about that. You found your way to rock and roll.
Yeah, I did. Music has been a pretty important part of my life,
Okay.
for most of my life, or probably all of my life. So, my parents are musical to a degree. My mom plays the piano and the veena, which is an Indian classical stringed instrument, and my dad is a pretty adept whistler. Can whistle in key and can whistle Indian Carnatic tunes by memory. But interestingly enough, it was my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who, without her really realizing it, she was the one who introduced me to rock and roll. And you would think this to be almost impossible or highly unlikely, because she, was, lived her whole life in India. But when we were in Chicago, and at that point my grandpa had just passed away, so she came to live with us in Chicago, and it was right at the time that Elvis Presley passed away. So for well, I shouldn't say for whatever reason, she was obviously smitten with him, as as all of us are.
Yeah.
But for some strange reason, she bought me a great Elvis Presley Greatest Hits cassette, along with this this magazine that basically talked about his life. So as soon as I heard that, I think the first track on that cassette was Hound Dog. And there was just something about, not even just the song itself, but just the just his voice and the guitars in Elvis's guitarist, his name Scotty Moore, and he had a very distinct style and has a very distinct solo in that song, and then the background vocals behind the solo in that song, for whatever reason, without knowing what any of that was, that just struck a chord, pun intended, in me at that time. And before that, I was basically exposed to, my parents would sing, Indian songs in the car, when we were on trips and things, and I would listen to whatever was on the radio. But that was my real exposure to rock and roll, I guess. So I would have been about 6 or probably 7, I think.
I just remembered when you were talking about your grandma and her unwittingly or unintentionally introducing you to rock and roll. When I think of my parents, especially my mom, I think of a, pretty conservative in a lot of ways woman. But, there was always music on the radio, right? Because TV was, at least, when I was growing up, it wasn't ubiquitous, but the radio was everywhere. And so you'd hear local music all the time. But I remember that my mom used to have one of those old vinyl players, the actual record players, which you'd take the speakers out, and they were wired speakers, and you'd spread them out, and then you'd play the tunes. And some of the music that I heard from my early childhood was, instrumentals like "Come September" or an Irish tune called Tom Dooley, or Tom Jones doing some of the Beatles songs, and this would have been early '70s. So that was kind of an interesting experience, and only when somebody brings it up and I go like, okay, so when did I start listening to music, and or rock and roll, so to speak. So that part of it is interesting. Now, as an aside. I know that you didn't spend a whole lot of time in India, but you come from, or at least you are connected to, it's Bollywood, right? Bollywood royalty in a lot of ways. You have people in your family tree who have been in movies, have been leading men and women on the silver screen in India.
Or so I've been told.
Yes, yes.
Yes, I am, but growing up, and even now, it was never made a grandiose thing. My grandfather was a South Indian Tamil actor, and it was always downplayed. It never really occurred to me that he was some big movie star, but and whenever I would be around him, it would just be like, he's my grandpa, It was just the regular thing. And interestingly enough, and he himself actually would never make it a big deal. He would never say, oh, come and watch this or come and do this, even though when I was younger, when we visited India, we visited him on the movie sets a couple of times, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But he would never make a big deal of it, and and this isn't really a regret, but for better or for worse, I never really got into or saw his movies in depth until after he passed away, which was in 2005, and then I was like, oh, I understand what the big deal was, and it was kind of neat, I could see that he was very good at what he did, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's my grandpa. So that was kind of cool.
It was kind of cool, and you sent me a couple of clips, and his sense of humor and his attention to acting detail. Even in those clips, it was obvious to see.
Yeah.
So rock and roll, and that made you popular in high school.
Well,
or was it a way of getting away?
Well, that's not entirely accurate because I kind of I think you could call me a closet guitarist or a closet musician when I was in high school. So no one really knew until later on that I was playing, and to be honest, because I didn't really have much of a social life, I was a good year and a half to 2 years younger than my classmates, because it's not like I skipped grades or anything, but I started early. So so really those formative years were kind of spent in my bedroom playing the guitar and kind of working on the chops. And it was only after I got to college that I met some like-minded people who eventually we got a band together, and that's when the work that I did in high school kind of started coming out into the open.
So I once read a biography by the great English guitarist Martin Taylor, who talks about teaching himself how to learn how to play the guitar. And he talks about, just wearing the grooves out on the record, because at that time there was no internet. So there was no YouTube, there was no shared tablature, there was nothing like that. So you basically learned to play by ear and tried to perfect the licks by playing the record over, there wasn't even digital players, right?
That's right.
So people would play the record, try and make the guitar sound the same. So we all, at least, the people who learned to play the guitar, I never really did, but learned to play essentially by ear and by copying.
Right.
So was that how it worked for you as well?
Yeah, and I don't want to be the old man yelling at the cloud, but yeah, they don't do it that way, to a degree. I mean, but yeah, I think, and other musicians of that era, whether you're a guitarist or any other instrument, I think that's the way we learned. Is we listened and we slowed down the cassette player or the record or whatever it may be, and just learned that phrase or that lick or whatever it might be. Listen to it over and over again until we got it. Now, that having been said, in this day and age, if you play in a cover band or something and you need to learn 30 tunes in a couple of days, all you have to do is go on YouTube, and there's some guy or gal who'll sit there and teach it to you, and it's invaluable in a different way.
So I'm curious about a technical aspect of it, which is lessons. Did you ever take guitar lessons?
So when I first started, I did take some lessons with a teacher who taught out of Mel Bay, the Mel Bay books.
Mel Bay method, right?
So I did that for 3 years, and I think that was invaluable from a kind of a theory standpoint in the beginning. But she was a pretty special lady, and her name was Ruth Pixa.
Uh-huh.
And she kind of, once she saw that I was into this and didn't really require any goading, or she just kind of let me do my own thing. Right. And then by that time, after I finished high school, I let those lessons kind of drift away, and but that foundation was still there.
So the reason I asked you was because when Martin Taylor talks about his early formative years, he talks about how that was part of it, but he also was well connected to a musical family, and they put him on the stage when he was like 10 years old or something like that. So there's stuff that you can learn from the books and looking at the tablature and hearing people play. But then there's technical aspects of it, how to do a hammer off, how or a hammer on, or a pull off, or a slide, and how to incorporate that. I mean, that technical part, somebody has to show you in order for you to understand what's happening behind the sound there, right?
That's right, and I guess the flip side of that is that was half the fun.
Yeah.
Was listening to something and you're like, man, what the hell is he doing there? I mean, that just sounds completely foreign to me, and then you would try to figure it out, yourself. I mean, a great example of that is, Eddie Van Halen's Eruption.
Ooh.
So when that first came out, and people listened to that middle section where he was using the technique of tapping.
Tapping, right.
No one knew what, I mean, tapping had been used, sparingly here and there at some point in musical history, but not ever in that way. So I think that was a sort of a shock for everyone's ears when they heard it, and everyone was like, well, what the hell is he doing there? And
right.
but you're absolutely right. It takes an instructor, or it takes watching someone doing it on YouTube,
right.
To it takes away some of that mystery, but
Yeah.
it gets the job done. You learn how to play it, and
I'm glad that more people have access to it. And, a lot of people might not have the wherewithal or the means to have actual music lessons. But if you have access to the internet, or if you have a cell phone, then, I think more people are able to entertain their passion for music. Before we segue on to, what happened in your life next, and it's an unfair question to ask a music aficionado or a musician, but who have been your major musical influences, and who do you enjoy listening to still after all these years?
Yeah, that is a tough question, because it's so, I mean, it's almost ubiquitous. You
Everybody.
You hear music in a little bit of everything, but yeah, for sure, in the rock and roll realm, it was, I think it was Elvis who started it, and then very, very early on, it was Billy Joel, and believe it or not, Barry Manilow.
Oh, I loved Barry Manilow.
This is before, and then I think, as far as rock bands, Queen and REO Speedwagon. REO Speedwagon, actually, the guitarist was from Peoria.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and then the other band members, I think, were from Champaign, Illinois.
Huh.
But yeah, I was a fan of them, and then I really got into a lot of the progressive rock bands. Huge Rush fan. They're probably my favorite band, and along with them, Yes and King Crimson, and then later on Genesis, and early Genesis, I should say.
When Peter Gabriel was still
Peter
part
Gabriel,
of it.
and to hear him and Phil Collins sing together is pretty amazing. Yeah, but bands like that, and then once I got into college, I was sort of semi-forced to, because I grew up in the mid-'80s, where it was, the decade of the guitar hero.
Oh, right.
So, but at the same time, the new wave era and alternative music was just starting to be birthed, And so by the time I got to college and started listening to other things, U2 and INXS and REM and The Cure and all of those other bands that were kind of becoming popular at that time. The Smiths, all those bands I ended up getting into, and learning a lot from them also.
Did you get into the whole grunge in the following decade?
Well, it's interesting, and that might be the segue, is that once I finished undergrad and grad school and was starting med school, that was around the time that grunge was, in the early 90s. I think, when the Pearl Jam, their album 10 came out, and Nirvana and Soundgarden, and that's right after that was kind of when I sort of I just stopped listening to what was on the radio or what was mainstream. And that's not to say it was just because I was focusing on school, but yeah, I just, for whatever reason, that I can't really explain, I just stopped listening to the radio.
Yeah. I've stopped watching the news. So
Well,
yeah. Where where do you stand on the whole Spotify thing that's going on right now between Neil Young and Joe Rogan?
you know, it's almost to the point where, these are such modern problems that you almost, you just sort of look at it from afar and say, gosh, I can't believe we're, having these kinds of dilemmas. But, I think, and I'm not a professional musician by any stretch of the imagination, but I think, the industry has changed a lot in that, you don't have these record companies that are signing bands and, then they promote themselves by touring and et cetera, et cetera. Now you just put your, if you've got a recording or an album or something, you have to put it on whatever
Streaming
forum,
yeah.
format, I should say, that, that is out there. So I have no idea about the business aspect of that and the complexities of that, but from what I've read and from some of my friends who are professional musicians, it's a different era.
It is
Than what it was before.
But just to provide you some perspective, Spotify paid Joe Rogan $100 million to acquire rights for his podcast. So I know that they're not going to let him go just for Neil Young's 30 songs that people still remember, even though I like Neil Young. And so let me ask you this: you've had bands for a while. You were in a band. You had your own band.
Yeah, so on and off, I've been in bands throughout the last 20 years or so.
What was your first band called?
Iterations. The first band I was in college, we were called the Young Serfs. So
SERFS.
Yeah, as in the sort of the in the hierarchy of. Yeah, we were right under vassals. I think. So we thought, the young vassals would probably not.
Was probably already taken.
Already taken. So that was the first band. I think I was 17, at that time, and it was great, and I still keep in touch with those guys, and those were lifelong friendships that were made, just from playing together and. Just going through that whole band thing, Shortly after that, I was in a band called Renaissance Moon, which, again, band members are just wonderful people. And but with that band, we actually wrote a lot of original songs, probably about 20 or so original songs that we did end up recording, not quite in a studio such as this, but it was back when it was right before CDs came out, so we recorded on a reel-to-reel, the old-fashioned way, and those songs are still out there on Reverb Nation, I think. And then, after that, I sang in a a cappella group in medical school, and then thereafter I was just sort of in, I'd find people to jam with, and for a year and a half, somewhere in the middle there, I was in a local band. But, as long as I'm, just for myself, I keep active with it, whether it be, personally on my own or. Like now, there are folks that I jam with on a regular basis, and it's all a little bit challenging with COVID, playing out somewhere, but as long as I keep it active, that's really all I can ask for.
So here you are. A bicultural kid, an only child who's in rebellion and is playing rock and roll. This could easily have metamorphosed into a Freddie Mercury story, but you decide to go to med school. Is it because your parents insisted that you go to med school, which was true of me, even though my parents were not doctors, but I was told, you're going to med school, and I was not given an option. How about you?
Yeah, it was a little different. You know, my parents were never really the type to say, "Oh, you got to go do this, you got to go do that," because quite honestly, I was a very mild-mannered, well-behaved kid.
Still are.
Well, I don't know about that. But you know, I'd always been interested in the sciences. But quite honestly, it wasn't one of these things where, you know, at the age of 15 or whatever, I had this vision of, oh, I want to go save lives and do all. No, it was nothing like that at all. It was, well, you know, what are the professions that are out there? And I knew I was interested in the sciences, so I kind of, once I started going down that route, it sort of evolved into, okay, this is what I'm gonna do. It wasn't this goal that I had since childhood or anything. And there's that, you know, whether this has been said before, you know, you can have medicine and music, but you can't have music and medicine. So I knew that whatever it was I was going to do in life, you know, as a vocation, I would always be able to have music on the side in some way, shape, or form, which probably wouldn't be the case were it the other way around.
Unless it was self-medicating.
Yeah, that's right.
Which a lot of our rock and rollers have been known to do.
That's right. That's right.
So you went to med school in Illinois or Missouri?
I went to St. Louis University.
So by that time, you know, by the time it came for med school, you and your folks were already in St. Louis then? So
I came to St. Louis for undergrad in 1986.
Okay.
And my folks were still in Peoria.
I see.
And they didn't move to St. Louis until very recently. But yeah, I started med school in the early 90s.
How did you find med school? Was it hard? Was it challenging? Or did you think about, what have I gotten myself into? When is this going to end? I think all of us go through when is this going to end phase, but how was it for you?
Yeah. You know, so before I did med school, I did 2 years of grad school.
Okay.
And I honestly thought that grad school was a little bit harder. I mean, just in terms of the, I don't know, maybe it was the subject matter I think was harder. I mean, I'd be, you know, I'm, you know, I would say in life I've been an average test taker, and, you know, I'm not some genius who, you know, knows it all. But, you know, in med school, I think, and you can attest to this and a lot of others, you know, it's the sheer volume, I think, that that is the challenge. That and, you know, a lot of those early basic science courses are, you know, I think almost just a kind of, you know, it's like working out, I think. You know, you're just sort of gearing yourself up for what is next. But, you know,
or playing the guitar.
Or play, that's right. That's right. Yeah. But,
riding
you know,
a motorcycle. Yeah, it's all the same.
But it's kind of like what I was saying earlier about, you know, assimilating into a culture. You know, as you're going through it, you don't really think, or at least I didn't. I didn't think about, oh gosh, I'm going through this, and you know, you just sort of do it, and then after it's done, you're like, oh yeah, wow, that was, I can't believe I did that, or you know, that's kind of how I feel looking back on it, because you know, even med school curriculum has changed a lot since we've gone through it, and you know, I can see that my eldest daughter is in medical school right now, and I'm actually amazed at the curriculum. I mean, it's
in a good way.
In a good way, yeah. It's very clinical based from the beginning, and the way they organize it, you know, by system and by organ system and everything is pretty amazing.
I will admit to you, I went to med school kicking and screaming, much as I, came into recovery. But, um, you know how people talk about having an epiphany and all of a sudden, you realize, okay, maybe this is where I'm supposed to be. And I remember, I had all these questions. I did find biology interesting in pre-med, but not to the point where, I was completely taken by it. I liked computers better. I liked electronics better. I understood circuits much better than I did the human body. But I remember the first time picking up Guyton's textbook of physiology and reading about the cell or, muscle physiology or some such obscure thing. And all of a sudden, I discovered, much to my pleasure, that a lot of the questions that I had in my mind about life and about, how things work, they were answered by physiology. And I do not lie to you, physiology was and still is. I practice anesthesiology, which is basically applied physiology. You give people medications and you see what happens to their system, and you, basically respond to how their system is reacting to the surgical insult. And I found physiology and I said, maybe I can do this. So did you have a favorite subject in med school?
So, and that kind of ties into what I did in grad school. I mean, I
forgot to ask you, what was your major, or, what were you going to grad school for?
So I got my master's in molecular biology.
Oh,
so,
very cool.
So the first year of med school, a lot of those classes were similar. So biochem and cell biology and things like that were the same. But I think it wasn't really until my, I can't say that any of the basic sciences hit me in quite that way. Although physiology, I totally agree with you, is interesting because it's more conceptual than just rote memorization, in terms of the subject matter. But when I got to third year, and going through the rotations, internal medicine appealed to me because of the detective work. At least that's what I viewed it as. So it's taking 20 pieces of seemingly disparate information and trying to put it all together to come up with one unifying explanation or diagnosis. I found that intriguing. It struck a chord in me in some way. So in med school, that's what and I like surgery too. But I can't stand still for that long.
Well, I can stand still for that long. I can't stay focused for that long.
Well, probably both.
Yeah. So, well, I'm glad you found your way to what you did, because I've watched you over the last couple of years, and these are extraordinary times. None of us, not any of us, prepared for this, or did even entertain the possibility that this could happen. And you've been truly at the front lines. There's a lot of posturing by healthcare workers, whereby, we say, oh, yeah, we're doctors, we're nurses, we're, respiratory therapists, et cetera, et cetera. I'm an anesthesiologist in a surgery center. We test everybody for COVID, and if they test positive, they're not coming into that surgery center, right? And we excluded the family. Your experience, on the other hand, has truly been at the front lines, because you are an intensivist, which basically, for those who don't know, is a critical care specialist. So you're the person who, when people get sick enough, not only with COVID, but, with cardiac problems, in post-surgical situations, with bad pneumonias, with out-of-control diabetes, you're the one who actually manages the sickest of the sick. That is what the definition of an intensivist is. Is that, am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
So.
And obviously you don't do it alone. You do it with group of highly trained professionals, intensive care nurses, respiratory therapists, people who staff the computers, who do the lab work, So none of us does this alone. We do this as part of a team that works. What was your first? Did you hear about COVID before you started seeing the surge in patients? Were you anticipating it? What was your experience dealing with that?
Yeah, so we did. The public heard about it. And I think it was January of 2020 when the rumblings were starting, and as an intensivist or as a practitioner, we've seen severe high acuity respiratory issues in the past. So what comes to mind was in 2009 when we had H1N1.
Mm-hmm.
So in the ICU, in the critical care realm, really the extreme or the highest level of acuity of a respiratory problem is something that we call ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome. So in this instance, patients are on a very high level of ventilatory support. So they're all on a respirator, and they're all on very high levels of support on the vent, the respirator.
So before we go any further, what you're saying is they are at a point where the disease has affected them so much that they can't breathe hard enough, well enough, or fast enough to get oxygen to the vital organs of the body, the brain, the kidneys, the heart, etc. So you have to support their breathing using a mechanical ventilator.
That's right. And it goes even one step beyond that. It's to the point where the lungs are so injured that the lungs can't do their job, basically. Mm-hmm. They can't exchange oxygen or get oxygen from the blood and then, deliver it, to the body, basically. Mm. So we didn't really have a sense, in January of 2020 that we were going to be seeing a surge of, ICU patients. I don't think we had that sense, although we had heard, there are some severe cases that were out there. But, what was to follow was, unprecedented, without a doubt.
And I have stayed in touch with you, over these last 2 years. We talk on the phone, we meet each other for coffee, etc. And I've talked to you when things were going really, really bad, when the numbers were really high, that, when you went on call or, you started working, and you worked down in Cape Girardeau, which is a city which is about, 100 miles south of St. Louis, somewhere around there, that you would expect to be awake at all hours, providing, putting breathing tubes in patients, putting them on mechanical ventilators. And I would ask you, how are things? And you go like, yeah, we're busy, we're getting slammed. And there was just not another thought in your head. And I could see the stress on your face, and I could hear it in your voice. And then there was some improvement when, the numbers started decreasing, and said, well, I'm not seeing patients who are as sick as I was before, and we're getting slightly better. And then, the curve went up again. Right. And I've always, thought about that and said, where do people like Raj and all the other people that you work with, and we know how short-staffed everybody is right now. We can't find people to work. And, the same work that was done by 4 people is currently being done by 2 or perhaps even 1 person, just because of, how things are. How have you kept going? And how long does one keep going in circumstances like this? Where do you find, the reserves of strength that carry you through this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, this is the third time it's come up in this conversation. It's as, it's, that thing of as the adventures are happening, you don't realize how much they suck. you know? So, it's as you're going through it, it's, you kind of look back retrospectively, and that's when you marvel at the situation. But how we get through it, I think, is really just a day at a time. It sounds very cliche,
Right.
but we know that, especially in my area of work, it's a 12-hour shift, and granted, disease doesn't sleep,
Right.
but we always have providers, physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists around the clock to care for patients, but. What was, looking back, I think, more so than how devastating the disease can be, how COVID-19, pneumonia, as it were, quote unquote, can be. It was the sheer volume that really just from a bare bones, commentary. It was the volume that was just. Again, we'd not seen volume like this before, but when you think about tertiary care hospitals running out of ventilators, this is something that you think, okay, maybe if I'm in a third world country, we might be, no disrespect to third world countries, but this is something that doesn't happen, in the U.S. But to be so low on resources, both from whether it be equipment or whether it be manpower, that was the real challenge. I mean, and then we're not even touching into the everything about COVID itself, and just not only the effect of the disease on the body, but also on the patients themselves, just the patients and their families.
Yeah.
It's, what I've seen in the last 2 years has really sort of affirmed my approach to, how I practice critical care. And, half of what we do is we talk to the families, and when we can, talk to the patients, because these are, again, unprecedented times where we do see a lot of good outcomes, but we've seen a lot of unfavorable but expected outcomes.
One of the things that I've admired the most about how you've dealt with this, Raj, is the fact that if I go on social media right now, I will be able to pull countless posts of healthcare providers who take care of COVID patients that have negative things to say about the unvaccinated, or people who won't wear a mask or what have you. And whenever I've talked to you, what I've heard from you is expressions of compassion, expressions of empathy, and the feeling that I really don't care whether these people were vaccinated or not. They're under my care now, and I have to do all that I can to take care of them. And that ability to suspend judgment and not take into account another person's, personal responsibility in being in the situation they are, and the willingness to help without rendering any of that, or without that hampering your care and delivery of it to the people who are in need. That is admirable, and I have a lot of respect for you for doing it in that way. And that has helped me tremendously in coming up with my own paradigm of dealing with people, which is basically, I can only control what I do. I'm vaccinated, I'm boosted,
Right.
and I'm willing to take care of patients as they come along. And if they decide not to do something that is recommended, then that becomes a personal choice, and I don't have much to say about it. I can
That's
only
right.
make my personal choices. So thank you for that, and I think I've taken enough of your time. If you wouldn't mind, I actually, as we started this, I brought a guitar in for Raj, and it's a flamenco guitar, and I will tell you the story as Raj perhaps picks out a few chords or notes from it,
Oh my
and I'll tell
goodness.
you how I came across this guitar, and that perhaps will form a way for us to make our way out of this podcast.
So first of all, I was not expecting to do this
Oh, that's okay.
at all.
Yeah,
But it's a,
you don't have to come up with anything spectacular. I'm actually, trying to set this up so you can, do a little bit of background strumming, and I will tell the story. And,
okay. Now, let's play something soothing. Well,
yeah.
your voice is soothing enough.
But it becomes better with your chords. So, I was in Spain on a motorcycle tour it must be 20 years now. And we were in Granada, and I'd just taken up playing guitar. And I thought I'd go out and acquire a flamenco guitar. I'm a big fan of flamenco music. So I made my way to this luthier shop, and he had a little bit of English, and I had some courtesy Spanish, so we started talking. And I wanted to acquire one of his guitars, which ran into thousands of euros, and I didn't have that kind of expendable money at that time. So I said, is there something cheaper that you can sell me? So he pointed out this guitar, which his apprentice had made for sale, and he revised it. And he said, I can sell you this for a lesser amount of money. And I said, well, I don't have that cash on me, but if you'll come back to the hotel with me, I'll get it to you from there. So he picked up the guitar in a case, and we started walking back to my hotel. And Granada in Spain has a lot of up and down streets, and as we made our way back, we had a conversation. And he was speaking in Spanish, and I was talking in English. And somehow we started talking about love. And I told him I was a little brokenhearted because my second marriage had just gone south, and I had gotten divorced, and I was trying to get away from it all by going to this motorcycle tour. And as we were walking, he says, well, why don't you hang on there and keep playing your guitar, and who knows, you might find love again along the way. And I still think about that day, and I think to myself, how is it that we can be so far apart, worlds apart, not speak the same language, and yet one person can understand another person's pain and give them some advice that will carry them through the day. And I love that moment and that day in Granada. And I hope that when you look upon this guitar, you experience the same serenity that I did when I heard him say it. Who knows? You might find love again in your life. Thank you very much for being with us today. I appreciate it. I love you like a brother, Raj.
Love you too.